high on a mountain, the warm winds are blowing, and where the winds are blowing to, there ain't no way of knowing. The mountain grass is short, it's dry and close to burning, crying out for water as the season's turning. Sweet smell of the pines, tall western cedar, drifting on the wind through the mountains like a river.
Hello, my name is Ayana Young, and I welcome you to Unlearn and Rewild, where we explore radical ideas relating to Earth renewal. Today we're speaking with Mary Ellen Hannibal, who is a Bay Area writer and editor, focusing on science and culture. Hannibal's book, The Spine of the Continent, is about a social, geographical, and scientific effort to save nature along the Rocky Mountains. The Spine of the Continent also chronicles landscapes, people, critters, and issues along the spine. A former book review and travel editor, Hannibal is chair of the California Book Awards. She was a 2011 Alicia Patterson Foundation Fellow. She is a recipient of the National Society of Science Writers Science and Society Award 2012 and Stanford University's Knight-Risser Prize for Western Environmental Journalism. Hello, Mary Ellen, and welcome.
Hi.
So I'd like to start off with a foundational question. What does the old way of conservation look like, and why is it not working? For example, Yellowstone National Park.
Well, this is really on my mind quite a bit these days. So going to the spine of the continent, to one of the major, of course, messages of the spine of the continent is that when we established protected areas like Yellowstone National Park 100 years ago, we thought, we would put our arms around a protected area, limit human impacts within that protected area, and then we would be protecting the nature within that area. And what conservation biology figured out is that that doesn't work for nature. Nature needs to be connected in order to thrive. So I look at the connections of nature in two ways, horizontal and vertical. And this is kind of a false construct, but I think it sort of helps. And horizontal, to me, describes species movement across the landscape. So in Yellowstone, you have wolves and grizzly bears that they stake territorial ranges that are much larger than those parks can possibly contain. And in the case of the grizzly bear, we have about 660 grizzlies in Yellowstone. If those grizzly bears don't breed with others of their own kind in other populations that are farther north and up into Canada, then the grizzly bears in Yellowstone will have genetic inbreeding and they will go extinct. And wolves similarly need to come and go in the park and and interbreed with other wolf populations to keep their genetic viability. And wolves, especially those top carnivores, typically mountain lions are like this and jaguars are like this. They need very large territories because they need to go out and stake new grounds away from their natal home. So that's horizontal across the landscape, and that's very difficult, right? Because we have all these roadways, we have human habitations, we interrupt the thousands of millions of years that these animals had this place to themselves. But we've also interrupted the vertical interconnections between species. So going back to Yellowstone, there's this really fantastic case study of species interactions between the wolf and the aspen, the cottonwood and willows, the vegetation of Yellowstone, and then everything in between, especially the ungulates or the browsers, and that's the elk, the deer, and the cattle. And when you have, paradoxically it might seem, when you have wolves on the landscape, you actually are protecting the greenery more because the browsers don't eat it all the way down to the ground. They look over their shoulders every 2 minutes to see if a wolf is coming, and they keep moving. And this movement allows the greenery to grow sufficiently that then beaver, for example, can use it to create their lodges and their dams. And when beavers do that, they slow the flow of water through the waterways, and many more native fish can thrive there. Many more species of bird come in, reptiles, amphibians, bugs. the impact goes all the way down into the soil. So when you have wolves on the landscape, you actually are sequestering more carbon in the soil. And this is where the biological carbon cycle, where you're having animals eating plants, intersects with the atmospheric and geological carbon cycles. So the atmospheric carbon cycle, of course, being where we're experiencing climate change, and then the geological carbon cycle where we have our very long processes like uplifting of mountains. But, we are taking stuff out, we're taking these fossil fuels out of the geological carbon cycle and putting it up into the atmospheric carbon cycle, which is disturbing the biological carbon cycle. And there you have your unholy mess that we find ourselves in now. So this is also, brings up this point. There's been a lot of talk around here recently, the last couple of weeks, about Jonathan Franzen's article in the New Yorker recently, in which he sort of decried the focus on climate change as distracting people from more immediate conservation goals. And I think he has a point. We do focus so much on climate change that it's almost as if that's our only problem. It's not our only problem. In fact, E.O. Wilson, just 2 weeks ago at Berkeley, he was at a conference for the national parks, and he basically addressed this issue, and he said, if we only change the atmospheric carbon cycle disturbance of climate change, we still will have an ecological meltdown, because we're experiencing a sixth mass extinction of plants and animals. And this biological meltdown, he points out, is fast accelerating. And if we lose the species, we lose the whole system. So if you just fix climate change, you don't fix the problem of extinction, because we're really mostly losing plants and animals to habitat loss. But then this is all complicated because climate change actually changes habitat. And this is something you see in the ocean. So the ocean is becoming inhospitable to some species that have lived there. We have this massive sea star die-off going on here, right off the coast of the entire West Coast. It's partly due to climate change. There's no doubt about it. It's too much CO2 in the water. And so this is where we can't really uncouple climate change from habitat loss. It's all happening, but we do have to approach both things at the same time. But the spine of the continent is really about how we understand species extinctions and what to do about them. And what to do about them is to connect and restore connections that have been lost between habitats and on a horizontal level. So that can sometimes mean making a highway overpass so that large carnivores can get from one place to the other. And it also means healing those connections in a vertical sense between species. So that means in some cases, and there's no one size fits all in nature, but in some cases, as in Yellowstone, it meant bring back the wolf to bring back the health of the river. I mean, it's just kind of wild how nature is so deeply interconnected.
Wow, that was beautifully said. Thank you for speaking on behalf of the necessity of biodiversity. And now I'd like to move on to another foundational question. What is the spine? And can you take us through some key points of its history regarding the Homo sapien migration and the geographic territorial understanding of this area?
Well, I'm so delighted to, because it's just really this epic, landscape story. So the spine of the continent refers basically to the whole Rocky Mountain Cordillera, which is this huge mountain range that extends from Canada and up in the Yukon all the way down into Mexico. And it really defines the entire continent of North America. And actually, then if you go down into South America, you've got the Andes that do a similar thing in defining South America. And there's really kind of a whole connectivity between North and South America along these mountain ranges. So about approximately, and this is always, paleontologists and archaeologists are always moving this marker around, but approximately, say, 13 to 14,000 years ago, the first humans came over to North America from across the Bering Strait. There seems to have also been some humans who came on boats around South America, this no Panama Canal in those days, and started to inhabit North America. And there were several pulses of people, and some came and went. I think that, you know, we have the oldest human settlements are in Arizona to the Zuni people. And then there were subsequent waves of people that came over and inhabited the whole continent with what we call, you know, Native Americans now. So the thing about the spine of the continent that makes it very important for conservation biology is that, first of all, mountain ranges are very important for conservation. You know, if you go from here in California up to Alaska, you'll find a big range, right? A big range shift of the kind of vegetation you find. If you go up a mountain range from the top of a mountain to the bottom of a mountain, you will find a similar elevational gradient of different kinds of biomes. And so mountains have all sorts of different, what scientists call heterogeneous or different kinds of habitat built into them. And especially with climate change, as species are seeking to remain in a comfortable temperature and precipitation envelope for themselves, mountains provide refugia. They provide places where you can find microclimates if you're a species that needs one. Also, the continental divide, there's sort of the heart, there's called the crown of the continent, is up in Canada, where there's a confluence of riverways that go to the east and the west and the north and the south. And then the continental divide, this waterway comes down. It's really kind of, it's the central nervous system of the continent. And here along the spine of the continent in the United States and in Canada and Mexico, because it is so rich in biodiversity, you still have these iconic species in many places that have been removed or extirpated in other parts of the country. So you still have wolves and grizzly bears and wolverine and all sorts of creatures in the spine of the continent, especially toward the northern part, that you don't have anywhere else. So when, you know, in my book, I profiled Michael Soule, who is considered the father or grandfather of conservation biology. And he was one of a team of people, really, of big names, including E.O. Wilson, Paul Ehrlich, Jared Diamond. Reed Noss is lesser known, and he deserves a lot more credit than he gets. For these guys figured out that what nature needed to do was to be connected in order to be protected. And then Michael was really, you know, impatient to actually save nature and not just talk about how to do it. So he founded Wildlands Network, what's now called Wildlands Network, with Dave Foreman. And Dave Foreman, and with Reed Noss, Dave Foreman was kind of a notorious eco-warrior who, he was a disciple, basically, of Edward Abbey's, who you might know from some of his wonderful books, including, what's the name of his desert one? Desert Solitaire. It's a beautiful book. So they said, we gotta connect up landscapes. And so Wildlands Network, which is this teeny tiny NGO, nonprofit, still tries to make connections and support the idea of connectivity along the spine of the continent. And they also train their attention on so-called other mega linkages on the continental United States. So if you were to look at a map of the United States, and if you go online, Wildlands Network, you can see on their website where some of these other mega linkages are. There's one along the Appalachian Mountains on the East Coast. There's one that goes horizontally kind of across the top of our United States and the bottom of Canada. And then another one, I don't think is on their map, another one here in California, we really have a Pacific wildway here along the Pacific Coast Trail. So these are places where plants and animals have gravitated to because there's shelter, there's a lot to eat, there's water. And so those are the things that plants and animals need, and that's where they have been protected the longest. Humans have built in the valley bottoms, and we've disturbed habitat in many more places, but we can't build the same way in mountains but we can in valley bottoms. So there's more left of the mountains to protect. So that's sort of the blueprint, is the spine of the continent. And in terms of the United States, and the reason why I chose to focus the book on the spine of the continent is that really we have more hope of actually connecting the spine of the continent than we do some of these other megalinkages, because it's a bigger landscape. There's less development on it now. There's more public lands, and there's really gigantic private land holdings, but sometimes by people like Ted Turner, who are extremely environmentally aware and focused. So like Ted Turner probably owns as much land as makes up a small East Coast state, here in the West. So there's really more of a chance of protecting the spine of the continent than there is, I think, of the other megalinkages. Not that we should not work for the other ones as well.
Besides conserving land, what are some of the other restoration initiatives that are most pressing for the spine? For example, the importance of roadless areas or building overhead passes to allow for animal migration.
The highway overpasses and underpasses to allow for animal movement across the roadways is super important. For one thing, it's something everybody kind of understands really quickly, because we've all seen roadkill. There's a roadkill database that's run by this guy, Fraser Schilling at UC Davis. And Fraser told me that his database of roadkill is the single largest database of species observations of any other kind of database. Now that is sad news, because that's all dead animals. But here's the other thing about dead animals on roadways: they cost money. They cost insurance companies money. They cause fatalities of people and destruction to private property, to cars. And basically, we all agree we don't want roadkill. So there's been a way to really be a win-win situation around getting highway overpasses and underpasses built and planned for, because whether you're a Democrat or Republican, whatever your attitude toward wildlife is, we all agree we don't like roadkill. So that's a super important way to actually talk about connectivity, because once you start understanding that animals in particular are moving across roadways, you start to say, oh, we're not the only people, we're not the only creatures here. There are other creatures doing their thing, and they're moving in their directions while we're moving in ours. And it makes, I think, you aware that it's not all about humans. And even though you don't see animals quite often because they don't want to be seen, they're still there, and we are obliged to help them live their life, and we actually really depend on them living their life to live ours. So that's a super positive direction for restoring the spine of the continent. We have this really devilish problem about large predators, and there's a kind of a warfare going on in the West, in certain states, around wolves, grizzly bears, and there's just people who hate them and really want to kill them, and other people who understand that we can't do that and keep a healthy ecosystem. We need those top predators on the landscape, especially in places where there's not a lot of human habitation, so you're not putting people in danger of being hurt. And this, I think, is where, on the top predator thing, I think the current usual strategies of conservation organizations, I think, could use a real revision. You're never going to change the minds of these people who want to kill wolves. The fact is, there's not that many of those people. They have more influence than they should, because of the way the political situation is in the Western states. But I think if you took the idea of the healthy landscape needing a top predator on it, and told that story, or as you know, I tell it in the Spine of the Continent, and you took all of the people in Denver, Colorado, who have PhDs, who are super educated and aware and environmentally sympathetic, and you told them what was at stake here. When you take the top predator away, degrade the ecosystem, it becomes very susceptible to climate change, to flooding, to fires. It does not sequester carbon well. You lose biodiversity when you lose that top predator. If you got all the people who are really capable of understanding this to even have that concept, I think you'd see a political shift. Instead of trying to argue with the ranchers, which is a lot of what some conservation organizations do, let's try to educate the broader populace in places like Denver, which have a big number of a highly educated population. This is something where I see citizen science as also really helping to give a big revision to how conservation nonprofits approach their work. Because citizen science can start in the schools. You can have kids tracking wildlife and understanding then as part of their lesson plans why they need to learn how to track wildlife, so we can understand where the wildlife is moving, so we can help continue connectivity. When you teach kids this stuff, then they bring it home. I mean, it's really not the kids that need the lesson, it's the parents. So there's ways in which to not keep having the same discussion over and over again in the West in particular, but anywhere, about how to approach these conservation issues.
I'd like to hear your thoughts about how cattle grazing is affecting the West. Some believe that there's no problem with cattle on public lands, and that grazing cattle can even sequester carbon, while others are fervently against cattle because they believe them to be detrimental to the landscapes, creating soil erosion and desertification while releasing methane. In one of my previous interviews, I spoke with Courtney White from the Quivira Coalition, who works with cattle ranchers in the Southwest to conserve land and sequester carbon through specific grazing management. So, what are your feelings on the whole cattle debate? I'd love for you to take us through the history of how cattle replaced bison and became the major industry in the West that it is today.
You know, this is another subject where I feel like more people need to have more information about how our public lands are being used. I actually am a huge fan of Courtney White, and I mention him in The Spine of the Continent, and I also talk just briefly about something called the Marin Carbon Project, which is here in California in Point Reyes, and this is a project that's really monitoring how to increase carbon sequestration by using cattle. The thing is that what Courtney White is in favor of is a kind of cattle grazing called mob grazing, or what else do they call it? Mob grazing, or just you basically move your cows around.
Holistic rotational grazing?
Yes. So this is when you do that kind of grazing, you can have a healthy ecosystem coexisting and even being enhanced by grazers. Now, in the Spine of the Continent, the thing is, you know, the entire West, there was this huge influx of cattle as a way to kind of make manifest destinies stick. We needed to have the West settled. We needed people to stay put and have homesteads and create communities, but we needed to give them a way to make a living. So that was this huge influx of cattle so that people could become cattle grazers. This is partly why, you know, what started our whole obsession with eating beef. And then that happened all over the West, even in places like the desert Southwest, where probably there were no big grazers on the landscape historically, and the landscape is simply not evolved to have cows on it. So Mary O'Brien, who is a wonderful scientist with the Grand Canyon Trust, she says, okay, there's just some places where we shouldn't have cattle. Other places you can have cattle, but we also need to graze them properly. And this is where they are not grazed properly. the negative ways that these sort of absentee ranchers who put cattle out on their landscapes and don't move them and let them eat down, they degrade waterways, they degrade the landscape. They eat all the way down to the ground, so there's no forage for other animals. There's nothing for beaver to use to create dams. And they have their methane and they destroy waterways. That is something that really could be reformed through grazing regulations, Forest Service regulations, Bureau of Land Management regulations about how to graze on public lands. And this is a big political quagmire. This is where I feel like if more educated people understood what was happening on our public lands, there would be a pressure on these agencies to reform the grazing practices. Now, it's just worth noting that when you read in the newspaper that the biggest single contributor to climate change is the livestock industry, that's really a different kind of cattle problem. That's industrial agriculture. And that is creating all sorts of horrible problems for other reasons. But really what the problem is in the West is that we're degrading the landscape. The amount of beef being produced on the West in these small grazing allotments is minuscule. It's just simply not even a very big percentage, something very small percentage of overall beef production in the US. Most of the beef production that is really detrimental is industrial agriculture. And Courtney White is not talking about that either. He's talking about ranchers in the West, where he's right. You want to keep ranchers ranching because then there's no development on that land. You keep open spaces. And on the edges of ranches and within ranches, you'll have habitat. You'll have ungrazed patches of forest or meadows where lots of species can live. And if you were to put a ski resort on that ranch, that would all be wiped out. So we do want to try to keep ranchers ranching, but we also want to reform the way that they ranch.
I really appreciate you elucidating the many sides of this complex issue. And to dive into the holistic grazing management a bit deeper, what are your thoughts on Alan Savory and his idea that grazing cattle can not only sequester carbon, but also stop desertification? I mean, one of my critiques of Alan is his lack of sensitivity to desert landscapes that never historically had big grazers to begin with.
I'll say one thing about Alan Savory. Alan Savory deserves an enormous amount of credit, and, he's really a path-breaking leader in holistic, sustainable agriculture and ranching. In not only my opinion, but in the opinions of other people, Alan Savory takes the whole thing with the mob grazing a little too far. He proposes that we'll never have the top predator back on the landscape. And so in order to replace the effects of the top predator by inserting massive amounts of more cattle onto the landscape. And he doesn't necessarily distinguish between where you could do that and where you shouldn't do that. So he goes a little off, a little exaggerated on one end of it. And I think, he has a lot of good points, but he takes it too far. Ranchers are by and large pretty hard-headed, reasonable people who are confronted every day with running a ranch. So a couple of years ago, I was at a conference, and it was in honor of Alan Savory, and Alan Savory spoke, and it was, an audience of ranchers was listening, and they were really keen to hear about, permaculture and moving the cattle around. And then he kind of went on to what you need to do is triple the amount of cattle you have. And then they were all kind of like, yeah, well, we ignored that part of what he had to say because that's ridiculous. And because, they don't have money to go buy heads of cattle like that, for one thing. So he's a little trickier character, Alan Savory. He's very charming. He's got a great South African accent.
Well, that always helps.
I'm going back to Colorado. rolling down the highway.
Another animal I wanted to discuss with you is the beaver. I just loved reading your sections on the beaver in the spine. You know, the Algonquin people have a creation story where the continents were made by the beavers, digging up mud from the bottom of a globe-encompassing ocean. At some point, the beaver, this great ecosystem engineer, fell from favor, was vilified and nearly exterminated by white Europeans. Would you take us through some of the critical things to understand about beavers and what the ecological impacts of their persecution may have been on this continent? And what would happen here, especially in the drought-stricken West, if beavers were welcomed back?
Well, those are just wonderful questions. I mean, when I was researching beavers for the spine of the continent, I felt like getting on top of the building I live in and shouting out to everybody, you can't believe how important beavers are to the United States and Canada, and everything that you have here is based on the backs of beavers. Because in fact, it was really when, the Pilgrims came over from England and they settled in Massachusetts and were really on the brink of starvation and just dying out when they were intersected with a Native American who taught them how to hunt beaver. And when they learned how to hunt beaver, they a fur trade started for those Pilgrims. Now, there had actually been fur trading going on before the Pilgrims came over. So the Dutch had been coming and harvesting beaver fur, and I think the French, there was a beaver trade that had started. And if you can remember, 1600s, 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, there was no central heating for anybody in those days, and it was cold in Europe. And the beaver has this incredible fur. So the beaver is one of these amazing animals that's kind of a bridge between a terrestrial or an earthbound animal and an aquatic or water animal. And it's partly because of this amazing fur that they have. They can swim and stay warm, and they have these amazing adaptations. They have these like goggles that come down over their eyes so they can see underwater. Back in the day, it was customary for Catholics not to eat meat on Fridays as part of kind of a Lenten ritual. But the Pope allowed you to eat beaver because it was felt that beaver were a fish because they swim. So they weren't even considered a mammal, which they are. If you think about this, I had never thought about this, but if you're gonna colonize a continent, right, you are gonna need to have an economy to do that with. And we grow up, I think, learning about the tobacco growing in Jamestown and sugarcane and then cotton. And that's all really very important to the development of the United States. But really much, much more fundamental was the fur trade. And over the centuries, the Native Americans, the French, the British, the Dutch, and then eventually what we call the Americans, all interacted over this fur trade. And at different times, for really long periods of time, that trade was dominated by different people, including Native Americans dominated the trade over and over again because they were the ones who really knew they knew where the beaver were, and they really were good at killing them. It also, I think, it enlightens us a little bit of not to romanticize Native Americans in such a way that, they would never deplete natural resources the way we do. Well, they did too. They depleted their beaver also. And what nobody was understanding is that beaver on the waterways change everything. So nobody understood you take the beavers off the waterway, you change the way the water works. You change the hydrological carbon cycle when you take beaver off. Because beaver are doing this thing, they're actually changing the flow of the water. And that changes the temperature of the water, it changes what can grow in it, near it, and it changes, the species interactions on the waterway. So by the time you can actually track the fur industry moving west, because what they did is they extirpated or took out every single last beaver off of every waterway, and then the trade moved west. And by the time it got all the way out to California, there was not going to be any more beaver left anyway. They took them all off. But, miraculously, kind of, it was figured out, like, we're not going to have this to base our settlement, our colonies on anymore. We need something else. We need another economy. That's when the cattle came in. So the cattle came in after the beaver. But especially in the West here, where we're really dealing with this horrifying drought, bringing beaver back to the waterways could just make an enormous difference. I mean, it's not so easy to just do that because, we have these dams and reservoirs and we have these delivery mechanisms of water to communities, and we can't just stop those. I mean, we need to keep getting water to people to keep them alive. But in many, many places where we're not purchasing water for humans, like in Utah, you could put beaver back on waterways in Utah all over the place. And you would instantly, basically, it happens amazingly fast. You would restore these degraded landscapes. And as we are hit by climate change, we need the most resilient landscape possible. That means landscapes that have growing on them more native species, more dense interactions between species. You want more native vegetation, which has been adapted to climate shifts over millions of years in a way that, invasive species probably haven't been. You want invasive species come in when the landscape is degraded. So a landscape, say, that's degraded by over cattle grazing might be invaded by Kentucky bluegrass. So that outcompetes the native plants, because the native plants can't grow up because they're constantly eaten down by the cattle. So the Kentucky bluegrass comes in, and if there's a large weather event, which we're having more and more of, like with flooding, all the Kentucky bluegrass is rhizomous. It's like wall-to-wall carpeting of grass. The whole thing just rips up in a flood, and all of that dirt underneath it, all that wonderful soil, is washed away. Whereas if that soil was planted, had native plants growing in it, they have much deeper root systems that hold the soil in place in a flood. Similarly with fire, invasive species are often, kind of like adding gasoline to fire. They burn so quickly. The native grasses and vegetation, some of them are adapted to come back in a fire cycle. Others, sometimes it's a little bit longer than we want to wait to see them again. But even in Yellowstone, where you can see the effects of the huge fires that happened a number of years ago there's a succession that there's native plants come back. It takes like 20 years to start seeing that, and we don't like to see burnt landscapes, but sometimes they're necessary. So putting beaver back on the landscape would really, really help the West in terms of holding on to water, having the water that comes down from snowmelt percolate more slowly through the landscape and sink into the landscape as it kind of comes down in rivers and creeks. When you have degraded rivers and creeks, the water hurtles down quickly and just gets to the ocean or gets dispersed way fast, or it evaporates, and it's not as useful to the surroundings. So you want those beaver on the landscape to slow the water flow down and to have the water percolate through the whole system in a slower way to nourish the ground and everything that's on it. And the thing is, beaver, they are a hardy species. They're a rodent. They have survived mass extinctions. They come back very easily. You can reintroduce them to places, and they do really well. So it's really a really good tool in the climate change toolkit to be pro-beaver.
Why do you think beaver has not been reintroduced in places like Utah more fervently? Are there any specific impediments?
Well, what you have, Mary O'Brien is a scientist that I profiled in The Spine of the Continent, and she works really hard to document how cattle grazing makes it impossible to bring beaver back to certain places in the national forests in Utah because there's no habitat for them. There's no cottonwood, willow, or aspen growing by the sides of the waterways because the cattle eat them too much. Now, so what she has to do is sort of prove this to the Forest Service. So what she does is she has citizen scientists in the summertime help her document damage from cattle grazing, and she shows that data over time to the Forest Service, and the Forest Service takes that data and uses it to help try to reform cattle grazing practices. Now, what do you have opposing that? You have the gigantic bureaucracy of these agencies in certain places. Here in where I am in San Francisco, both the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, which are, federal agencies charged with natural resource protection of one kind or another, they're pretty nimble and they're pretty enlightened about what they want to do on the land. They have the right ideas. In some places, you have kind of, a hand in hand Forest Service or Bureau of Land Management people kind of in the pockets of some ranchers who just don't want to change anything. And they just stonewall any kind of change. And again, it's not that many people, but it's going through this tedious process. And it's going too slowly because we really need these landscapes restored as quickly as possible. So again, it's very important for NGOs, yes, to keep working at trying to get those grazing rules changed, but more important perhaps to let educated people understand what the consequences are on the land and say, a handful of people are standing in the way of you and very negative effects of climate change. And that's what I wish would happen more.
Me too. It's time the public stood up to take control of our public lands again. So I've lived in the Pacific Northwest for the past few years and wonder how beaver would interact with salmon, especially considering the droughts and low water levels in the rivers and creeks that support salmon.
Let's kind of take a big lens on that. It's a really good question. I mean, I think you actually touch on a couple of really important things with that question. Basically, though, historically, no beaver ever interfered with a salmon. The salmon developed their incredible life history alongside beavers all over the place. Today, it's true that in some places, we've fragmented where we have salmon left, where we have beaver left, and in some places it's possible that a restoration for a certain population of salmon would be negatively impacted by a beaver dam. And then maybe on that particular landscape, you would not want to have beaver until the salmon population got to a certain level. But, and sometimes we're just going to have to make those decisions between species on a local case-by-case basis, basically. So this kind of triage where you have to choose between one species over another, we do have to get used to the idea of that because we have such a degraded reduction of wildlife that in some places it is one population versus another. But salmon and beaver are historically not at odds with each other and not in the way of each other.
The water comes swirling in the night while she sleeps. The moon is dark, the air is old, and in the flood tide creeps. The past will be washed away, the future is water. You are an orphan no more, you are the river's daughter.
Now back to the spine. What is the current status of the project as a whole, and where are the efforts most concentrated?
Well, right now, Wildlands Network, which is this little tiny nonprofit that really works to promote. And what Wildlands Network does is it convenes lots of other nonprofits along the spine of the continent who are all interested in connectivity, and they all try to coordinate their efforts and look out for places on the landscape that might need protection and nobody's quite paying attention to them at the moment, and they try to hold hands across the landscape. A lot of the effort that I see is going into trying to change Forest Service rules, kind of on an administrative level is really where the focus is at the moment. Part of this is because of funding, and nonprofits, they sort of have to go with where their opportunities are and shift with that. When I was researching the spine of the continent, I frankly, I don't hide this, I don't think that these nonprofits can possibly save nature in the kind of time frame and on the kind of scale that is needed at the moment. And when I was on the spine of the continent, I was thinking, what could possibly scale to address this loss of biodiversity at the level at which it is going on? And that's where I came to citizen science. And I participated in some citizen science projects on the spine of the continent, and I saw that people of all walks of life were coming together to learn something about nature and to do something about it and to volunteer their time. So one wonderful example is in the Sky Islands. One of my favorite nonprofits is the Sky Island Alliance. And I learned how to track large carnivores in Mexico with the Sky Island Alliance. And what they do is they train citizens who are Tucson residents how to track wildlife. And then those citizens go back, they get a certificate, it's a program, and they're assigned to transect in Tucson. Now, Tucson is a small kind of old city that has a suburban sprawl around it, but it also has a lot of nature kind of all the way up to the back gates of Tucson. And it's surrounded by this, incredible, beautiful Sky Island region of the nation that I love it there. It's so beautiful. Something like half of all native bird species in the continental United States are in the Sky Islands. I recommend visiting there. Go to Mount Lemmon and take a hike. It's just so fabulous. So what's happening is large carnivores, jaguars and ocelots, are moving north from Mexico back, and they're reclaiming some of their historic range. So jaguar used to be found as high as Monterey, California, not that long ago. So what the Sky Island Alliance is doing is trying to see where are these animals moving and how can we protect those passages, those corridors. And with the data that citizen scientists have gathered about where animals are moving, the Sky Island Alliance has succeeded in getting plans underway for highway overpasses and underpasses. And I see that's conservation happening. They actually had outcomes. That's a conservation outcome. I find that a lot of the administrative stuff going on with changing Forest Service rules is not really having a conservation outcome. We need to protect landscapes and species. We need to do that right now. And rulemaking is very important, but there's more urgent things to attend to, I think. But the thing about citizen science is that today, with your smartphone, you can take an observation, like say, of a mountain lion paw print, and you can geolocate it, date, time, latitude, and longitude. You can make a precise observation of where that exists, and you can show that to somebody, and that can be verified. So it puts the power of Darwin in your hands. Darwin went around, to the South America, to the Galapagos, and he noticed what species lived where, and in what amounts, and in what relationship to each other. This is the question we are still asking. We don't have that perfect information yet. And this is what we need to know so that we can protect where they are and where they're going with climate change. So citizen science is a way for people to get involved. Wherever you live, you can look at I think it's citsci.org. There's tons of programs. Right now, you can join something called iNaturalist.org. You can get an account and you can start making species observations wherever you live And you can take a look on iNaturalist for projects, because there's all kinds of different projects you could participate in on our iNaturalist, just with your smartphone or your iPad, or with a camera and a computer that you would upload the photographs to later.
I love how citizen science empowers us to take back the knowledge and ultimately the control of our homes and bioregions. It's so easy to feel debilitated with all of the destruction happening, but to have this tool, every person can be an integral part of conservation. It's just so exciting to imagine. You mentioned your new book is about citizen science. Could you give us a sneak peek?
My new book about citizen science is focused a lot on California and the Bay Area because, part of being an eco-citizen is the power of place. Like, where do you live? Who else lives there with you? What are the processes going on where you live? And you know what? We all live in places rich in species and rich in biodiversity and rich in historic species interactions that may not be here now, but may be possible to reintroduce. So, my new book is also just a journey for myself through kind of the hero's journey, as Joseph Campbell framed it, to try to understand how people can live, profit both biodiversity and humanity at the same time. I have some despair at going through what E.O. Wilson calls this bottleneck that we're in right now of overpopulation and environmental degradation. But I do see that this bottleneck is also what Joseph Campbell would call the threshold that the hero crosses over, and that we can change ourselves and how we orient ourselves to the world, to the earth, by becoming citizen scientists. I will say that I spent some time, I had an opportunity to really devise how citizen science could be used as a tool to achieve the spine of the continent. And here's my concept. The spine of the continent is all about connectivity. So what I would envision for the spine of the continent to kind of circumvent all of these political quagmires that people get into in trying to change grazing practices or to try to do this or that, is have some hubs in Denver, in Tucson, somewhere in Canada, where you had sort of citizen science central locations. And people could come, like let's say you did this in Tucson, and people could learn how to track wildlife, but they could also learn how to watch for birds. They could learn how to use something called Nature's Notebook. This is Nature's Notebook tracks phenology, or the coming of spring and animals going in and out of hibernation and pollination, all the interactions between nature. This wonderful program called Nature's Notebook, you can also just join that right today online, allows you to do that. And then what I would like to see is have these hubs have visualizations on a website. So let's say it was Tucson, and you could go onto your website and say, where are the ocelots today? Where are the jaguar? Where are the hummingbirds? And what's coming into bloom? Where are the invasive species? Is it the time of year that it's the most productive to try to mow that down right now? And then I think people would start to see patterns in nature themselves. They would connect the dots that, sometimes scientists don't connect the dots between what's happening in one place and another, or between what's happening with one species and another. And we could keep tabs on that in real time. And then ultimately, what if you had a website where you could look at what's happening in Tucson, you could also look what's happening in Colorado, what's happening in Montana, and start to make really bigger regional and continental scale observations. So to give you an example of what that might reveal, in Colorado, we have a big problem for them because of climate change is causing snow melt to melt faster on the tops of the mountains. So what that is doing is it's making spring come earlier because the flowers are cued to bloom when they get that water starting to melt. So the trouble with that is that nobody gave the hummingbirds or the migrating birds the memo to come at a different time. So they come when they used to come, but now they're coming and they're sometimes missing their food source. Then there's a hard frost that happens in Colorado, and that's killing the buds that have come out because they thought it was spring already. And then, to add to this sort of devilish thing of climate change doing this, in years past, there's been this dust problem. So this is a problem originating in Arizona, where you have ATV activity and development breaking up the desert floor. The desert floor is covered with this very delicate but very strong crust that holds the dust in place. But when these ATVs go over it, it breaks it, right? They have these gigantic dust storms in Phoenix. But that dust goes up into the atmosphere and it goes and lands on the mountaintops in Colorado. Because it's dark, it changes what they call the albedo, or the reflectiveness of the snow. And just like, when you're really hot outside, you want to take off your black shirt and have a white shirt on. The blackness actually makes the snow melt faster. And that's when we start to have a regional, continental, local, regional, continental conversations about how what we do in our local places have regional impacts and have continental impacts. And then that's how we start making the best decisions about how to manage our human activities so that nature can thrive everywhere.
Wow, I absolutely agree that if people felt the effects of biodiversity loss closer to home and understood that they could personally do something about it, then we would have an epic movement on our hands.
Well, thank you, Ayana, and I really appreciate your interest in it and your good comprehension of how nuanced it all is. And it's something we just need to really spread the word about.
Thank you for joining us on Unlearn and Rewild. Our first music selection was Stick Game Song by the Bad Canyon Well-Pinnit Singers from Washington State. Then Colorado Song by the Ozark Mountain Daredevils. And lastly, The River's Daughter by Sharon Krause. Our theme song is Like a River by Kate Wolf. Production was by March Young.
Through the mountains like a river, sweet smell of pines, tall western cedar, drifting on the wind. Through the mountains like a river.